SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome again to the NPTEL course, The History of English Language and Literature. Having discussed in detail the flourish that the Romantic Age had across genres and across classes, it's important to see what the Romantic Age was doing to the women writers of the period. We noticed multiple times from the Renaissance times onwards that the canon was a little lopsided. It only had male writers predominantly. But however, from the Renaissance period onwards, we had also been taking notice of women writers who also made a mark in the literary canon. But alongside, at the end of the discussion of every age, we also had been taking a look at some of the women writers who were left out of the canon and whom the later historians do consider with notable import and merit. In this lecture, we try to identify some of the women writers of the Romantic Age who were left out of the canon, who were forgotten, or who had not been part of the major literary histories and major critical discussions. When we look at the canon of the Romantic period, we again surprisingly realize that it's an all-male preserve. Of course, there were discussions that we had about Mary Wollstonecraft and her foundational role in the feminist writings of even the contemporary, and the works of Frances Burney, which were much appreciated by even writers such as Johnson. Mary Shelley, who had an envious literary and intellectual tradition and also enjoyed immense popularity through her work Frankenstein. And of course, Jane Austen, who is considered as the foremost women writer from the 19th century. And Maria Edgeworth, who inaugurated an entirely new kind of writing by focusing on the Irish regional novels. But apart from these major writers such as Mary Wollstonecraft, Frances Burney, Mary Shelley, Jane Austen and Maria Edgeworth, it's very difficult to come across another woman writer from the Romantic period. It's this question that leads us to a discussion and to an engagement with a variety of writers who also were writing during the Romantic period. And one cannot talk about the revolutionary tendencies and also the newer experimental forms of writing of the Romantic Age unless one decides to cut across not just genres and classes but also gender as well. Among the pre-Romantic writers, the important name which we have not yet come across is Charlotte Smith. In 1782, she published a sonnet written at the close of spring. It concerned with nature and time, and it also in that sense keeps in tune with the spirit of the Romantic times. Her 1793 work, The Emigrants, was more political in nature. It also articulated her disillusionment with the French Revolution. But however, it's useful to remember that politics was still considered as a male forte. For the same reason, most of the leading women writers, we do not find them engaging with the political affairs of the times, nor do they give any direct opinion about the major socio-historical and political things which are happening in England or in Europe during those times. Charlotte Smith's best known work is a poem titled 38. It was a poem to a woman friend of hers when she reached that august age of 38. At this juncture, I also considered it is quite interesting to draw a comparison between Smith's poem titled 38 to Mrs. H with Lord Byron's 1819 poem Growing Old. In both of these poems, and Lord Byron composed this poem when he reached the age of 30, and it's very interesting to see how both of these poets had almost similar thoughts when they reached a particular age which they thought was quite a turning point in their own life history. Charlotte Smith writes, "With eye more steady, we engage to contemplate approaching age, and life more justly estimate with firmer souls and stronger powers. With reason, faith and friendship, as we will not regret the stealing hours that lead from 38 to 48. And Lord Byron's 1819 poem Growing Old reads thus, "You've passed your youth not so unpleasantly, and if you had it o'er again, 'twould pass. So thank your stars that matters are no worse." So we also notice that irrespective of the kind of canonical status that these two poets enjoyed, we find a marked similarity between their range, their versatility and their treatment of one particular theme such as age and growing old. Another important woman writer in the late 18th century was that of Charlotte Lennox. She had spent a few years in America and that also had influenced her writing immensely. So, her 1750 work, The Life of Harriet Stewart, is set in America. She also had composed in 1752 The Female Quixote. Lennox's works were interestingly endorsed by Samuel Johnson and Henry Fielding. That ensured her some kind of an acceptance during her lifetime, but nevertheless we do not find her being rated among the other important writers of the late 18th century. The other writer who also signaled a transition from the end of the 18th century towards romantic concerns was Mary Mitford. Her poem Our Village focuses on the ways in which Englishness could be located in the villages of England. And she also talks about the leisurely ladies, the hardworking yeomanry, the mercantile middle class and the tensions of the country life versus the city life, and these incidentally were also the major themes that framed the romantic writing. Mary Alcock was a writer who experimented with a wide range of genres. She also wrote about many poetic forms such as songs, epistles, descriptive and narrative verse. However, her most significant work was a 1799 poem, The Chimney Sweeper's Complaint, in which many feel that she also had echoed Blake. However, in comparison to Blake and other major poets of the period, her tone is more pathetic than socially concerned. Susanna Blamire was a poet who was best known for the location in which she spent most of her times, that was Cumberland, and many of the Lake poets including Wordsworth and Coleridge used to spend a lot of their time in Cumberland. But however, in spite of this commonality that Susanna Blamire shared with these major male poets, she was not known to them. Susanna Blamire was also a great documenter of country life, and the Rutledge History of English Literature notes that she deserves to be considered with Burns and George Crabbe, two of the leading figures of the Romantic movement. In 1842, Susanna Blamire also published her collected poems, which however were not considered of much worth by most of the critics of those times. Clara Reeve was a novelist of the period, and her most important work was not a novel but a treatise titled An Argument in Favour of the Natural Equality of Both Sexes. This was published in 1765, and we also see that not just Mary Wollstonecraft but many of these writers, these lesser known forgotten writers, also had laid the foundation to the feminist movement, which was to reach its maturity and ripening only in the 20th century. And Letitia Barbauld was one of the significant women writers of this period. She was immensely influenced by the American Declaration of Independence and also the French Revolution. In that sense, in her, we also find one of the indicators that women were also equally influenced by the political affairs of the period, and they were also equally enthralled by the new ideals that the French Revolution had provided. However, not surprisingly, her work also met with long delays before it could get published. One of her important works was titled The Rights of Woman. In this, she makes a very bold statement: make treacherous man thy subject, not thy friend. And due to the many feminist ideals that she spoke about, and due to the bold treatment of the gender problem of those times, her work, though written in 1795, could not be published until 1825. It's important and useful to recall that many women writers of those times faced this difficulty in getting their work published. Though in a way the literary world and the artistic world was getting more open and more accessible to the to women, in general there was a certain distancing and a certain aloofness that they felt when it came to meeting actual success or reaping good literary benefit. And Letitia Barbauld was considered as a very industrious writer. She edited almost 50 volumes of the British novelists in 1810, and a poem titled 1811, published in 1812, was written in the heroic couplet form, and this incidentally it does have much political value as well, because it was one of the first texts to foresee the decline of Britain's wealth and power in the increasing prosperity of America. So, this was quite important text during those times, but however, due to the lopsided way in which the canon is framed and the particular texts are foregrounded, we do not find Barbauld's text getting the kind of attention that it really deserved. Felicia Brown, who is also known as Felicia Hemans, she published her first volume of poems at the age of 15, and she was an immensely prolific writer. And she, compared to many other women writers, she did not face much difficulty in getting her work published. In 1812, she published Domestic Affections and The Forest Sanctuary in 1829, but she is most famous for her poem Casabianca, which also has this extremely famous opening line, "The boy stood on the burning deck whence all but he had fled." This was a discussion about one of the recent happenings of those times, where a particular boy, he could not leave the deck of a burning ship because his father, the captain, had not given him the orders. So, this was also a political controversy of those times. It also, the incident also had evoked multiple and varying responses, and for Felicia Brown to capitalize on the popularity of this event was quite appropriate, and Casabianca remains one of the most discussed texts of those times, and incidentally this opening line is also much quoted in various other contexts as well. But though she was a little unconventional in some of her works, we do find her conforming to the dominant conventions of those times, particularly as we find her writing in the homes of England, the stately homes of England, how beautiful they stand. Maybe it was for the same reason that she did not encounter much difficulty in getting her work published, because they were not really challenging the status quo or going against any of the dominant conventions. She was not very radical in any of her articulations, and she was also considered as one of the biggest selling poets of the first half of the 19th century. Mary Robinson, who was born Mary Darby, she also had many things to her credit. She was a poet, a novelist, a philosopher, a feminist, an actress, and also a celebrity in the early 19th century. In her work, The Haunted Beach, published in 1800, we find her echoing Coleridge, and she also anticipates Shelley. In that sense, she could even be considered as a bridge which connected the early romantic poets with the later younger revolutionary poets. In her work, we find the picture of solitude, guilt and desolation of a shipwrecked mariner. So, it is in this sense that we find her echoing Coleridge and his work as well. Letitia Elizabeth Landon, who used her initials to write L.E.L., she was the first woman writer to earn her living entirely from her writing. Her most important work was published in 1837 as Ethel Churchill. She, however, unfortunately met with a mysterious death when she was in West Africa. Mary Jane Jewsbury's first publication was in a local newspaper. It was a satirical poem, and she is also said to have anonymously published Phantasmagoria, or Sketches of Life and Literature. It was a 2-volume collection of poems, literary sketches and short fiction. It was also dedicated to William Wordsworth, who also published her work immensely. So, we do find the women writers being forced to have the patronage, the literary patronage of more popular writers of those times, and we also find that this gave them much advantage and gave them much mileage over the other writers. Mary Jewsbury also married William Q. Fetcher, and then she sailed to India, and we also find that she died of cholera 7 months after arriving in Bombay. So, we do find her becoming a victim of the colonial expeditions of those times. Lucy Aiken was a woman writer who began her writing career at the age of 20. She was initially working as an editor and also as a children's writer. It is useful to recall at this point that most of these women writers earned their living by writing books for children, because women and children were becoming avid consumers of new kinds of fiction that was getting popularized in the 19th century, and it was generally considered as an inferior genre compared to the other more majestic genres of poetry and other forms of writing. So, it was usually considered appropriate that women were more suited to write these works, and as a result most of the children's books of the early 19th century were all written by women. Her important works include epistles on women, exemplifying their character and condition in various ages and nations with miscellaneous poems. And in this one, she also exhibits a feminist strain of thought, because she talks about women to be in more equal status with men. Lorimer is a work by Aiken, which was also considered as a Gothic novel. And here we find that the women were willing to experiment in all forms of writing. They were not limited to a particular genre or a particular form. The same kind of revolutionary spirit and the experimental nature that characterizes most of the major writers of the Romantic period could be found in the writings of these lesser known women as well. She was also famous for her review on lyrical ballads titled Poems in 2 volumes by William Wordsworth, author of the lyrical ballads, and this also had appeared in one of the leading periodicals of that day. Susan Ferrier rose to fame as a Scottish regional writer. And this was also the time when Maria Edgeworth's Irish regional novel was getting immensely popular in England, and along with Walter Scott, Susan Ferrier was also a writer who decided to write about the Scottish regional life. So Ferrier was also a very clever painter of the Scottish life, just like Maria Edgeworth had presented the Irish characters. Ferrier's 3 novels talk about the Scottish life: Marriage, published in 1818, The Inheritance in 1824, and Destiny in 1831. But however, when we talk about the canonical mainstream literary history, it's quite unfortunate that Walter Scott gets all the credit and all the fame for talking about the Scottish life, and all the other writers who were perhaps only partially famous during their own lifetimes, all those writers get hugely eclipsed and they never got even the kind of attention that they deserved. And being a woman added more to this neglect and this forgetfulness, and we do not find Susan Ferrier being mentioned at all throughout the discussion on Scottish regional novel, which is heavily overshadowed by Walter Scott. In these 3 novels of Scottish life, Susan Ferrier exhibits an acute power for social observation, and however, this quality which she is said to have inherited from Austen, it's also peppered with more didactic intent. This was also one of the reasons that did not endure much popularity for Ferrier's writings. As we begin to wrap up our discussion on the women writers of the 19th century, it's important to highlight the role played by these 2 figures, Joseph Johnson and Thomas Longman III. When we talk about history, one should not forget the many facilitators which made it possible for various kind of writers and their writing to be foregrounded at particular points of time. Joseph Johnson is a radical figure whom we encountered even during our discussion of Mary Wollstonecraft. Johnson was the editor of the Analytical Review, and he was the one who encouraged and initiated the publication of the works of Wollstonecraft, Lucy Aiken and Anna Letitia Barbauld. Thomas Longman III was associated with Annual Review and Athenaeum, 2 leading periodicals of those times, and he was the one who initiated and supported the publication of the works of Maria Jane Jewsbury. So we find that there are these many unsung heroes in literary history whose role also needs to be foregrounded and celebrated with much mirth and much delight. So with this positive note, we wind up today's lecture. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.